Okay, yep. So welcome back, everybody, and thanks for sticking with us. I know it's been a long day so far, and we've got a couple more sessions to go, but it's well worth the wait. So please stick with us if you can. So it gives me pleasure to welcome back Brian Marshall from Vanguard, and he's going to talk to us today about a topic that I've found quite interesting over the last couple of years, which I think, Brian, is becoming more and more fashionable, isn't it? This business of zero trust.
Right.
So over to you. Thank you for joining us again.
All right. So good morning, good afternoon, and/or good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Marshall. I'm the president of Vanguard, and this presentation is going to be on zero trust. Our agenda today is the first thing we're going to do is try to define what you're going to get out of the presentation. Then we're going to talk about the network as it exists today in most organizations. We'll talk about zero trust as a term. Zero trust versus zero trust architecture, because they tend to use those two terms interchangeably. Uh, then we'll go into the 7 tenets of zero trust. Um, sorry, my son's dog's in the background in front of me, moving around. The components of the zero trust architecture itself, some of the other components can go into a zero trust architecture. And then we'll talk about the zero trust network. Finally, again, we'll compare that to basically look at the way we want it to be. And then there's really one use case that I popped in here, but that one use case can actually be applied pretty much across the board and was designed to give us a idea and the paradigm shift, if you will, that zero trust is supposed to cause within an organization. So zero trust isn't just a brand new product. It's really a paradigm shift for your entire organization to go from, we'll talk about that in a minute, because the purpose of this presentation is to help you understand what that paradigm shift is, to educate you about zero trust. And I'll tell you that I am not an expert on zero trust by any stretch of the imagination. What I did to put this presentation together was I went out and I read the original Gartner paper that was the genesis of zero trust. I then went and read the NIST paper on zero trust. And then I combined those together to give you my best understanding of the information that was provided to me in a cohesive way. And then I went and I started looking for diagrams of zero trust. And it turns out that diagrams of zero trust that really drive home the point of zero trust are not easy to find. But I found one and then I modified it, not significant. Well, I guess I modified it significantly to give you a better view of zero trust from my perspective. So first of all, I want to make sure that I tell you that I did borrow stuff from Gartner, NIST, and this the diagram was derived from somebody else's work. Then I also wanted to make sure that you guys understood that this presentation is an introduction to zero trust and by no means goes into great depth. And hi, Sonny. My son's dog is. Hold on one sec. Can you? I'm on a presentation, son. Sorry about that. And there she goes. All right. So let's start off by looking at the network architecture today. And we see a lot of familiar elements in the network architecture today. We have a identity and access management solution here, really an IDM, that's used to provide a mechanism for authentication of users. We have a demilitarized zone, which devices connect into many times through a VPN when they're outside the network firewall. And, and hold on one second. My son's now trying to coax his dog into her room and he's bouncing a ball. So if you hear a bouncing ball in the background, that's why. So you've got a DMZ, and once the user and the DMZ is penetrated through valid methods, penetrated, probably a bad word, trust is established, and that trust leads you to having access to everything in the network. And you can see we've got auditing logs, we've got certification, labels, encryption, access and runtime controls, threat intelligence. And behind that, we've got the network itself. Again, the network can be segmented or not. You've got network delivery protocols, you've got all your infrastructure, applications, data, etc. And all of that's backed up by a compliance system. So this is sort of what we see today with a network firewall all the way around this information here. And so one of the things we see in networking today in organizations today is that once you've established trust, you're trusted, period. And that establishment gets you through and into the network, and you can pretty much get to whatever you're authorized for. Well, in zero trust, we see a different approach, and I need to move. I'm going to minimize that. There we go. We see a different approach, and that is the users and the devices and everything else, all they go through their authentication mechanisms. You do device inventory. Everything's, instead of having a network drawn around all of your devices and equipment, instead you've got this thing that sits kind of in the middle here, or should I say, it really encompasses all of this. And if I were to change this picture, I might drag this and drag it all the way over here and say all this is inside of the CDM PEP bubble. But there's a reason we didn't. And the reason is that this policy enforcement point, which makes up the policy engine and the policy administration and the diagnostic module and the threat intelligence, all come into play in terms of whether or not a user is able to access a specific resource. And we'll talk more about that here as we move along. So now that we've talked a little bit about what the network used to be and where we want to go, let's talk about zero trust and zero trust architecture. So zero trust itself is really a term for an evolving set of computer security paradigms that move us from a network-based security architecture where the network is the line by which, if you penetrate or gain access through, you are assumed to be trusted and you are assumed to be who you are, and therefore you are given access to any and all resources that you are provisioned to have access to. in so in zero trust, what instead you do is a set based authentication and authorization mechanism that is not network based, but based on the entirety of the the individual and his attempted access to an asset or a resource. Okay. And a zero trust architecture itself are the principles that you use to plan your industrial, your and enterprise infrastructure and workflows. So in other words, one is an architecture and one is the security paradigm. Zero trust being the security paradigm and the architecture being the diagram and the method by which you use to plan out zero trust itself. So basically put, zero trust is a collection of concepts and ideas designed to minimize uncertainty. Notice, not eliminate. We can't eliminate uncertainty from the idea of enforcing accurate, least privilege per request access to a asset or resource. But instead, we want to minimize our uncertainty as to whether or not access is a valid access being done by a valid entity, and that valid entity identified themselves the authentication mechanisms that give us the belief, the surety, the belief that that they are who they claim to be. And again, my internet connection is unstable. Um, I hope you guys can still hear and see me. Can somebody validate that?
Yes, I can still hear you, Brian. You were a little bit patchy
Oh,
just a few seconds ago. It's I just
and
yeah.
I've lost my headset again.
Oh, let me
Oh.
just
Okay, so I will continue on. Again, zero trust architecture is the actual architecture behind which you plan and implement your zero trust solution. Okay, so in a very high level view of zero trust, a user comes in, we identify and verify and validate the user. We validate the device that they're coming in on, and we provide that user and that device limited access privilege to the assets that they are attempting to access. In other words, on the mainframe, we all know limited access. We all understand that we want to provision with the minimum possible access. We never want to give somebody more access than they need. And that is a basic tenet, if you will, of zero trust. Um, Zero trust security models, this is important. Assume that an attacker is present in the environment. In other words, instead of assuming that your network security is preventing attackers from getting into your network, in a zero trust security model, we assume they're already there. And because of the assumption that they're already there, we think and implement security in depth and authentication and authorization in depth, if you will. It really is a new paradigm where the enterprise must assume no implicit trust for any access to an asset, whether it's a hard asset, a soft asset, a cloud asset, IaaS, PaaS, what have you. Every asset and everything within your organization is viewed as an asset. All assets are assumed to need protection, and protection is built into every asset at every level possible. Um, and the good news about zero trust is this. Zero trust is not a brand new product. You don't go out and just buy a zero trust solution and implement it within your network and voila, you're there. It's not a module that plugs into your cloud provider, hybrid cloud provider, or internal network. It's really a security modality that you implement within your organization. And the good news is, if you go back and read the original Gartner paper, the claim there was, and the implementation was, that organizations shouldn't just go out and buy a bunch of software to implement as a zero trust architecture and zero trust model. Instead, what they look for is the enterprise to use existing architecture and software and devices within the organization to achieve zero trust. Now, that may mean, of course, retraining of individuals. It may mean you buy some new software pieces. It may mean you redesign your network. Actually, it almost necessarily does. But the reality and what they were trying to achieve behind zero trust is the following simple paradigm. Set up your network and all of your devices and all of your applications and all of the everything that you consider to be an asset. Set it up within the organization such that no one is trusted and that there is a trust model setup that any individual or device or access or transaction must flow through in order to achieve trust. And once it achieves trust, it can be that trust can be taken away. Just because you achieve trust doesn't mean you're going to keep it. And that every asset within the organization needs to be protected as such. So, Therefore, the goal of Zero Trust is to prevent unauthorized access to data and services, coupled with making the access control enforcement as granular as possible. Pretty simple and straightforward. It's a concept that all of us are familiar with. We all understand least privileged access. We all appreciate that. We all try to achieve it. But for a moment, let me paint a picture in your mind. And that picture is somebody gaining access to your frame. At the end of the day, most mainframe access is implemented through least privileged access. But once that identity is in the mainframe, they are not forced to and through re-authentication simply because they requested access to a different resource. Now, that can be implemented in certain circumstances using MFA and application MFA implementations. But by and large, most organizations that I've run across, and I suspect that you, they operate on the idea that once you've achieved trust, you keep it through the life of the session. And that flies in the face of Zero Trust. Okay. So Zero Trust does have some requirements, and one of them is the policy decision point and policy enforcement point. And because of that, we understand and know that Zero Trust applies to both authentication and authorization. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well, but we're going to first talk about the 7 tenets of Zero Trust. And these are the tenets. This is the paradigm shift that you want to communicate to your organization in order to achieve Zero Trust. There are going to be components of Zero Trust that you may or may not own within your network today, and you may have to go out and purchase in order to achieve some of these tenets. But these tenets themselves stand on their own as the lofty goal or the method by which Zero Trust can be achieved. Okay, so first and foremost, all data sources and all computer services are considered resources. Anything and everything within your organization, whether it's hardware, software, data, all of them are considered resources. And that that knowledge, that paradigm shift in thinking doesn't require us to actually go out and buy software. But there's an important underlying corollary to this, and that is every device and every piece of software that is not owned by the organization, but brought into the organization through BYOD, or what have you. I almost said B because I want to drink. No, just kidding. All of those devices and software are considered resources as well, and all of them need to be protected. The second tenet is all communication is secured regardless of network location. Well, this is kind of a no-brainer, right? And a lot of us have implemented this across a lot of different organizations or within our organization. But the tenet itself is vitally important, and that is all communication, any communication, every communication must be secured. And but what we mean by secured is there is authentication and encryption for data on the fly. So the communications itself is established through a recognized authentication method, and then the data that is transferred across is encrypted. Next, access to individual enterprise resources is granted on a per session basis. And this is where people, myself and others, can get confused with the meaning of a per session basis. In this case here, if you log on to 3270 on a mainframe and you're out accessing different resources, we think of that entire time that you're logged on as a session. But really here, the per session basis is the every time you go after a specific resource and establish communications with that resource or issue a transaction to that resource, that is a per session basis. And access to that resource is never guaranteed, even if you are properly authenticated. So access to resources, this goes on to tenet number 4, is actually determined by a dynamic policy. And part of that policy is the observable state of the client identity himself. What do I know about this client, this user that's attempting to? And when I say user, it could be human user, service user, non-human user, whatever. What do I know about this? Where did it come from? How did he establish his credentials? When he established his credentials, what device did he establish it from? What IP address is he coming from? What else do I know about the observable state of this identity? All of that information gets used as part of my dynamic policy for determining whether or not access to a resource is going to be allowed. And like it says, this may include other behavioral and environmental attributes. A behavioral attribute is something such as, I've been tracking this individual identity for the last 6 months, and this user has never attempted access to this resource on a particular day. And because of that, I may want to reevaluate whether or not I trust that individual or that identity for providing access. So there's an on the fly dynamic policy that determines whether or not access is going to be granted or not to a resource. Number 5, the enterprise monitors and measures the integrity and security posture of all owned and associated assets. This goes back to the BYOB. We all understand that we're required to keep track of the security posture of every device that's owned by the organization. But this takes it a step further and says not only what's owned by the owned within the association, but all associated assets, whether they're a BYOB asset or whether they're a B2B asset, where I've got business coming in or transactions coming in from outside assets. So now we've kind of grown not kind of, by definition, have grown the sphere of our influence to being around all assets that access our resources, whether we own them or not. All resources, on to number 6, all resource authentication and authorization are dynamic and strictly enforced before access is allowed. And again, this sort of follows up with some of the other tenets that I've been talking about. But essentially, authentication and authorization aren't static. We don't use a single method. They're dynamic and they can change over time. And they are strictly enforced to a minimum set of rules before I allow access. And once I allow access, again, I can still remove it for any violation of an authentication or authorization mechanism. Last and not least, the enterprise collects as much information as it possibly can about the state of everything: assets, network, infrastructure, communications, users, security posture. Everything is used, all of that is used to help it improve its overall security posture itself. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the components of the Zero Trust architecture, and which make up Zero Trust. Again, the architecture itself are all the parts and pieces that make up Zero Trust, and Zero Trust is the overall paradigm of what it is we're attempting to achieve. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a policy engine. And this is a component that's responsible for the ultimate decision as to whether access is going to be granted to a resource for a given identity or subject. The policy engine itself uses enterprise policies as well as inputs such as trusted algorithms, external resource knowledge, threat intelligence. All of that is used to simply determine whether or not access is going to be allowed. And the PE, the policy engine, is paired with a policy administrator. And the policy engine itself again, makes and logs all decisions approved or denied. And then the policy administrator is the portion that is responsible for the execution of that decision. And and in my diagram, the policy engine sits right down here along with the policy administrator uh, to make up the policy enforcement point or the policy decision point. So the policy administrator, like I said, is a component responsible for establishing and or shutting down the communications path and essentially the identity, but of the subject and a resource via commands to the PEP. In other words, the policy engine makes the decision that says, yes, I'm going to allow this individual access to that resource. The policy administrator then allows that to happen by either opening up the communications between the identity and the resource or subject of the resource, or if for some reason trust is revoked at any point, it's also responsible for shutting it down. And again, the PE and the PA kind of sit together as part of the PDP. Okay. The policy enforcement point is a system responsible for enabling, monitoring, and eventually terminating connections throughout the entire network. And it is a single logical component of the PEP of Z, but maybe broken down into multiple components. The EP is derived of the PDP, is again the PA and the PE, which sounds acronymic, but essentially think of this intelligence, where in the intelligence you have an enforcement point that says at this point everything is going to be evaluated by the policy engine. That policy engine is going to make a decision and communicate it to the policy administrator, the policy admin, and the policy admin is going to implement that decision, and that the PE and the PA are at the point of policy enforcement, and the PE and the PA make up the PDP. Whew. Okay. I know it takes a minute or two to consume all of these different acronyms, but essentially just think of it as a decision point with an engine of knowledge behind it and an enforcement within it, and that it's at a single point where you can capture all of that authentication and attempted authorization or traffic to a device. So really it can be spread out across the network in terms of micro segmentation, but it's got to be a single point with any micro segmentation where it can gain control, ask the questions, make the decision, and enforce it. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I'll pause here for a second because that is a fundamental tenet behind an implementation of zero trust. So, and essentially everything you need to implement a base zero trust. The rest of these slides are going to be on components that may or should make up your zero trust in addition to the PEP, PDP, PE, and PA. And one of those things is the continuous diagnostic and mitigation system. And this is basically any system that's responsible for gathering information about the enterprise assets and other assets that have been used to connect into my enterprise, and applies and updates to those assets, configuration and update to software. And so it's really a so the CDM's job is to sit there and collect all sorts of information about every asset that connects to it. Oh, hello, Mr. Asset. What level of operating system are you running? What is your patch level? What kind of software do you have running on you at the moment? What software do you have installed on you at the moment? Oh, I see you've got an out of date software. Well, I'm also not only responsible for collecting this information. My job is to make sure you're at an approved level of software. So my job is to now go talk to the PEP and the PDP vis-a-vis the PE to tell the PA, you're not allowed until I do some to you. And he sits here and communicates with PEP and the PE and the PDP and the PA and lots of, I almost said lots of peeing going on around here. My apologies. And then I said it anyway. So he sits inside of that cocoon and helps make decisions. Next thing, of course, is our industry compliance system. Um, Industry compliance systems are a requirement for all organizations. And so it's included in the zero trust architecture because it's also responsible for evaluating the compliance set of a device and making decisions on it. And it's important to note and understand that some decisions are instantaneous, others can take a while. Going out and doing a software inventory of a device and then checking the device for compliance across all of its configuration or a piece of software or a database isn't a fast process. So the CDM and the ICS run kind of in the background collecting this information. And sometimes that information is incomplete. And the PEP and the PDP and the PA and the PA all have to still make a decision as to whether or not that device or identity is going to be allowed to access the resources of the system given the limited information it has. And its goal is to gain all information and keep that information up to date such that when that new device connects or the user comes in and connects, it already knows about the device, what's installed on it, what its level of software for every version of software has running on it, so that it can go look at another component of the ZTA called the threat intelligence feed to determine whether or not that version of software running on that device has a known threat and needs to be patched prior to allowing it into or access to a specific resource. So this is a threat intelligence feed, and this you can think of this as sort of like the security content automation protocol created by NIST, where NIST has a security vulnerability database of all different vulnerabilities with threat assessments and scores tied to each one, so that your organization can go to that threat intelligence feed, given the level of software you're at, and ask the following question: are there known threats that exceed my threshold of threat acceptance? And if it says yes, what are they? And how do I resolve or fix those threats within the devices that connect to me so that I can resolve them and then allow them to continue to access resources. So the threat intelligence feed is a key part of this. It's not just for finding new viruses. It's really about flaws in software, viruses, reported attacks, methods and configuration by which I can reduce the probability of allowing attacker in. And that's, again, it shows up here on our picture. Okay. The next thing is, and I think I'm still doing well on time, half an hour. So
you're doing fine, Brian. Yep.
Good, good. So the next thing is network and system activity logs. Duh, right? Absolutely, duh. Everybody pretty much does this today, but let's again keep in mind that these network and system activity logs are not only going to be used to keep track of what has happened within my network and within a resource, but also as an input back to my continuous diagnostic monitoring system as a method by which it can use to determine whether or not to update the algorithms within the policy engine to determine access or modifications to access. So in other words, we now have created a feedback loop where my activity logs are going to be driven back into my policy enforcement point, my policy decision point, if you will, where the enforcement point also is, that goes into my policy engine to help me determine whether or not a current or subsequent request to a resource within my zero trust network is going to be successfully authenticated or allowed to proceed. And you can see that in our diagram up there. Okay, so the next component are data access points. These are the attributes, rules, policies, procedures about access to enterprise resources. Think of this as sort of like the RACF database and Unix services permissions, but it's basically the set of rules that can be encoded that allow the policies to determine authorization access to a resource for the least privileged access for accounts, application, and services within the enterprise. These policies should be defined in the defined mission roles and needs of the organization. In other words, you have to have a global view of how your organization is going to work. You're going to have to create roles within your organization. You're going to have to provide least privileged access to those roles. And then you're going to have to come up with a way to communicate that in a way that it can be consumed by your PEP, the PDP at the PEP for the PE implementing the PA. Okay. And so we can see some access and runtime controls there. Of course, the next component is surprise public key infrastructure. We need PKI. If we're going to do encryption across the board for communications, we must use PKI. If we're going to be encrypting data at rest, we need PKI. So your current PKI system, whatever it is, can be brought into your ZTA for use for your enterprise encryption key services. And again, this is an important part of the ecosystem. All of us should be familiar with it, but essentially we need some method to raise our assurance that the data that we're transferring across our network or the data at rest is in a form such that should somebody gain access to it, it is for naught, as the data must go through a process of decryption. And again, we can see that here on our sheet. And of course, we get down to our identities, our identity and access management system, or really our IDM, the system that's responsible for creating, storing, and managing enterprise accounts and the identity of those accounts, whether it's LDAP, whether it's RACF, whether it's Windows LDAP, Active Directory is kind of is an LDAP. But we need to keep information in there, and we need to protect the information as well: the name, email address, certificate, the identity, and then other information such as that will be used by Zero Trust, such as where does this user normally authenticate from? What area of the world is he in? What kind of device does he connect to me with? What kind of browser? In other words, and I've run into this a number of times, right? I have online banking, as most of us do, and I go to my online bank and I go to sign in, and I'm using Internet Explorer, and I get in and I say, yes, save my credentials. And I get in, or I say no. I, I have multi-factor authentication on most of them, but either way, I get in, I do my business, I get back out. I come back to my computer and I fire up Chrome, not realizing that I used IE last time, and I go to my online bank and it says, hey, you're coming from a different browser, buddy. you're going to have to multi-factor authenticate before I'll even allow you to give my credentials. And then it'll call me on my phone and I'll press one and it'll go, okay, you can now move forward. So it's not just authenticating the user, it's authenticating the method by which they've gained access. And any change to that mechanism needs to be looked at with a jaundiced eye to determine whether or not we're going to allow that authentication. So again, dynamic methods of authentication and authorization, and authorization of the user and its access. Okay. And again, we can see our IDM over here on the left. And another component that many of us are aware of is our SIM, the Security Information Event Management, along with logging. And again, some people use the SIM as a log. And I want us to understand that they are separate components. The SIM will keep information, almost always a subset of the information from the log, and then we'll evaluate that information to provide either reporting back to an individual or information back to a point where someone can make a decision as to whether or not a security event has actually occurred. In this case here, the SIM is going to be getting the any and all data points from any and all different assets within the organization that it needs to evaluate to then communicate along with the logging mechanisms back to the policy engine and the policy administrator for security actions. So the SIM, which all of us are familiar with, I would hope, and if you're not, please feel free to ask. The SIM's a known component in most networks, but by and large, the SIM isn't used to its capacity. And so in this case here, the SIM becomes a important point of or an important place in our zero trust architecture to provide, again, feedback loops to our ZTA. And you can see that over there under audit and logs. Okay, so now we've talked about zero trust. We've talked about the zero trust architecture. We've talked about the components of zero trust, and we land back on our original slide of the architecture itself, so that we now have a better understanding of how all of this works. A user with a device or a device comes into my network. I have an inventory of that device. Hopefully, I have identity providers, MFA, to evaluate user session risk for that specific identity. And I have device risk and compliance status of the device. All of that information is fed into the policy enforcement point, which is part of the policy decision point. That enforcement point is a point in the network where I'm enforcing this. Again, it can be many places via micro segmentation within my network, but it's got to be running everywhere. By the way, if you read and I failed to mention this, if you read the original Gartner definition of zero trust architecture, it calls for one other thing. As I recall, it could be more than one, but it's an important distinction. And what that distinction is that my entirety of all of my zero trust network architecture and communications has to itself be segmented from my entire rest of the network. In other words, everything, all of the communications that is done by all of the different pieces of my zero trust architecture is a network on its own and is a secured network that people don't gain access to devices through. There will be a policy enforcement point in their network that will send information, gather all this information and send it into my CDM and my PDP and my PE. And my PE and PA have authority over that other network, but I'm not part of that network. I've been segmented so as to provide security within my own network. And I failed to mention that earlier. Sorry about that. Okay. And so we can see here we've got the policy enforcement point with the engine evaluating the information provided, using the CDM data, using threat intelligence, getting information, and then making a decision, and the policy administrator then enforces that decision, and access is either granted or denied to specific resources on a per session or per transaction basis, and that trust, once established, can be revoked at any time. Okay. And so now we're on to my very simplistic use case, but this is simplistic, but in my mind, it helps drive the point home. And that is this. We have a user, and the user presents his identity. In today's environment, he presents his identity to the authentication mechanism, the IDM. And usually the information about that user, is limited. Sometimes it is only the IP address of the user ID, their password, and or other authentication mechanism. The identity is confirmed and their session access is granted. And in this case here, session access can be network access, can be to anything and all things by which the user has requested access to. And in Zero Trust, a similar thing happens here where the user presents their identity, but while that identity is being confirmed, it is going to look at their IP address, it's going to look at their MAC address, their physical hardware network address. It's going to look at what type of equipment they're using or attempting to use to access this resource. They're going to look at the levels of software and whether or not they're back leveled. It's going to check to see, hey, is this user already in some established session? Or is this a duplication of the session? Is the user attempting access within normal specifications, time, day, etc.? Is this session access too close to a previous session such that I know a human user couldn't have created this request? Is there anything else about this request that gives me pause in terms of granting it? So in a non-zero trust environment, generally user ID, password, MFA, maybe MAC address, maybe IP address. In the new paradigm of zero trust, it's going to be every piece of information I can garner about that individual's identity and the resources that he's using to access my systems and the systems he's accessed. Has he accessed this before? Has he ever attempted this? If not, why? If yes, when was the last time? What authority did he request last time? All of that information comes into play into zero trust, along with the entire view of the world, and that is trust nobody. Verify everyone. Verify and verify often. Verify given the endpoint the traffic's coming in on. Assign risk criteria to every access attempt. Segment access resources and networks. Don't allow application data and ZTA communication to occur on the same network. ZTA must use its own network. And remember, guilty until proven innocent over and over and over again with a caveat. Just because you've been found innocent doesn't mean you're not going to be found guilty. Questions?
No questions in the chat, Brian, but I'm all. Are you all peed out?
Yes, I am. I would like to point out, for those of you who may be wondering what the picture is behind me, that is that is Lady Godiva on a horse. It's actually a relatively famous painting. This is done, and I know all you were seeing was probably the lower half of her bare leg. So I wanted to make sure you saw that it is not a picture that you can't necessarily see.
I was going to say, I was wondering whether we needed to rate this recording as 18+ viewing. Yeah. So any questions for Brian? And it looks like your battery's running low by the looks of it, Brian, on your laptop. I can see flashing.
Yes, it is. I decided to move because the other background was a tiger with a Disney character, and I didn't think that was. She's scantily clad, by the way, and I like that background less than I like this one.
Okay.
This is original art that came with my house, and I haven't been able to remove it because I like it.
Yeah. So we have a question from Damien. Hi again, Damien. He says, are you seeing any companies actively driving this new architecture with their organizations? Within their organizations? Oh, are you still there, Brian?
He probably has to plug in.
Yeah. I think we might have lost him.
Give him a second, Jamie.
Okay, Rox.
I think he's powering.
Powering up.
Powering
up. Yeah. Yes, I agree, Damien. It's an excellent question. Yes.
I'll just give him 1 second.
Okay.
Jamie?
Hello.
Did you want to pause the recording?
That's a very good idea.
It's actually not restarting. Anybody that does have questions, please put it in the chat, and then we'll respond to those once we get him up and running.
Okay, no problems.
My apologies.
No worries, no worries. I mean, I was going to actually ask the question to Brian, as maybe it's a sort of discussion that I really like the concept of zero trust. I'm a bit, I suppose, you know, the way that I kind of think about security approach about it. Some might call me a bit right wing. You know, I like things secured. Secured properly, and this sounds great, but it kind of was dawning on me through listening to Brian's session that I wonder how much it costs to actually implement, especially if you're a very mature organization, you know, where you've had, you know, platforms like the mainframe around for a very long time, and we know what kind of state some of those platforms, you know, may or may not be in. Just you know, the actual cost, and you know, is it more kind of great if you're like a new organization, you know, and you're establishing new processes, new technologies, etc., but how to deal with the kind of the more mature, you know, processes and systems that are around. So just a thought to put out there to people.
Yeah, but Jamie, would it be a case of they'd be thinking about it, and then they get a cyber attack and the cost that will cause, and then suddenly, you know, they think, well, actually it is worth putting in zero trust, so maybe they'd be forced into it, you know. That's just a thought, that was all.
Yes, yeah.
My concern is, from your survey, you know, only 40% are putting in MFA. How many people are going to make that big leap into zero trust? Well, it's a great concept, but as you say, it's getting the momentum and the cost in front of people that they're going to budget for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The cost is always an issue, right? I mean, let's face it, any procurement person you're dealing with, cost is an issue.
Yes.
But what I do want to say is that the zero trust, we've done this presentation. The one Brian did today was a little bit more on the technical side, but we've also done the presentation to a audit side. And I will tell you, there was extreme interest from the auditing and compliance side. I think you're going to see the push come from there first, and then that kind of comes down from auditors doing audits that will drive that.
Hey,
Yeah.
Roxanne?
Yeah.
Yes,
you hear
Milt,
me?
you want to comment because you did do that presentation.
Yeah. Hey, Jamie, this is Milt Rosberg.
Hi.
Hi. We're seeing a big push in the federal government.
Mhm.
And they are the United States federal government. I don't know about the other governments like the UK and Germany, but a huge push. We attended last year about 8 days of discussion on zero trust, and it was all the fact that they're very, very concerned, very concerned. And I think it's more of the chain supply. An example would be if you're a manufacturer of chairs and you have a contract with the Army to supply chairs, and if I can get into the chair manufacturer's system, I am now a trusted resource to go into the federal government Army system, which gets me into the rest of the Pentagon network, if you will.
Yeah.
So it's making sure all those things are trusted.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, we just had that huge problem where a vendor was hacked, right? That supplies software.
Mm-hmm.
So that software supplier, their system was hacked, which gained access into the rest of the universe.
Yeah.
And so it's that's really the push for it. And if you think about the credit bureaus that have been, I think all the credit bureaus have been hacked at one point or another.
Yeah.
But now they have all the information right down to the color of your eyes and your family and where you're born and all that other kind of stuff. So it's easy to duplicate that. So I think that's the push for it. And one of the things in the audit presentation, the question the auditors are being posed is, if somebody is in my computer, whether most likely the mainframe or another system, and they want to look at the payroll file and you're down inside that payroll file, how do I know exactly what they looked at? How long were they in there? And what did they do?
Mm-hmm.
And so that takes on this whole other concept of privileged access, who has access to what and how you're going to do it. The other thing is with robotics and artificial intelligence, that's going to be the next wave of hacking. And so that allows you to run as many programs as you want to get into a system and crack it, whether it's a mainframe or open systems architecture. And because of that, everybody wants to make sure the person at the other end is trusted. Yeah. So this is coming, in this, my opinion, this is coming. We have some very large financial organizations are looking very, very hard at this. Very hard at this, but I know the government space is, and in the United States, and I can't speak for other countries, but when you get an award, let's say you're the chair manufacturer and you're in North Carolina, and you get the award for the chairs for the Army or the Pentagon or for some other division within the government, that is announced. It's publicly announced that you won the bid. And that's part of legislation, that you have to be fair to everybody. And when you bid on it, and then who won the bid. And so that automatically tells the bad actors, you want to try to get into that chair manufacturer. So.
Yes. No, thank you, Milt, for explaining that. And I can see in a supply chain as well that this is, adds incredible value. It really does. Yeah.
But take it in the transportation community. Let's say you do a train system, and I'm a supplier of the doors that go on a train for your subway system. Now I have secure access to that. And if you're a really smart guy, with all kinds of artificial intelligence, I could probably figure out how to hack into the train system. Right? If you're that's what you want to do if you're a nation state actor. So that's the part of it. Even take a look at the electrical grid. And if you're a supplier in the electrical grid, you supply the wires and you get in, you could take all the electricity down. I mean, these are the kind of things that they're trying to fight, I think, with zero trust.
Yeah. Kira, I think you were going to ask a question.
Well, no, I was just saying, I think the mainframe is kind of going to end up behind the door the same way it does with MFA in a lot of this, because how many people can actually send their security logs to an SIEM? All of the log. That doesn't have to be selective and only send specific events, because you get back the response of, oh, well, your logs are too big, we can't take them. If you haven't got it in the SIEM, then the decision that's going to be made on whether that access is allowed or not is going to be undermined. So I can see it still being, you might have for segmented parts of a network and increasing your network segmentation, but I can't see it going down to the level of, well, you normally only use this KICS region, why do you want to use that other one now? But I hopefully could be wrong, because I'm sure IBM hopes so, because they'll get to set lots of MIPS.
Hey, Jamie, Brian is able to get back on if you let him in for any final questions.
Okay, let's have a look. Yeah, he's just joining now. Any more questions for Brian? Hi, Brian, are you back?
I think that Pete Buckley sent.
There we go. Can you hear
Hello,
me?
Brian.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Rox and Milt have done a very good job in fielding questions. So,
Oh,
yeah.
Good. That's why we have people as backups to
Yes.
step in when the computer dies unexpectedly.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. It should have had like another half hour to an hour, but apparently not.
Yeah, no. I mean, Damien had asked a question around: are you actively, are you seeing companies actively driving, this within their organisations? And I think Milt, you articulated that very well, where you're seeing it right now, like in federal government, and but I mean,
Right.
yeah.
And the other thing I would add to that is if you go out and look at there are a lot of different software companies that are attempting to provide solutions for zero trust, and that's led to a lot of different views of what a zero trust network architecture would look like, or the overall architecture itself. So look at everything with a jaundiced eye and understand that there is no perfect right answer for what zero trust is, other than ensuring that everything within your environment and outside of your environment has defense in depth, has everything, all inputs to identity and access management with least privileged, and that you do a per session authentication and authorization, and that your policies are dynamic with network segmentation, encryption, logging, threat intelligence, all of those pieces. How you make them up can be entirely different, but it starts with a paradigm shift in the process of identification and authorization of access to any one given resource.
Yep. Very good. So we're right out of time now, folks. But thank you so much, Brian and Milt and Rox, for backing Brian up as well. It's very well done. Thank you so much. And like, any more questions for Brian, you know where he is. But it's a very, very interesting topic, and I think one that we are going to hear more and more about over the coming months and years. So thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate the time, and everybody have a wonderful rest of your day. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rox. Thanks, Milt.
Be safe.
And same to you. So we now have a break. Let's take 10 minutes, and we have the last session at 6 o'clock UK time, and that's up next with Al Surratt. We're going to be talking about the SolarWinds supply chain breach and what that means for us mainframers. So do stick around for that. But for now, go and grab yourself a beer, a wine, a coffee, wherever you are, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you.